All right, so let's get into this. So, good morning, everyone that's attending today's webinar session. This webinar will be covering authorizations and form settings within SAP Business One. This is obviously the route to any user access to the system and the experience they're given within the system, covering, what the look and feel of SAP Business One is for that particular user, and also their authorization and privileges throughout the system as well. So there's a number of areas to consider as part of a user setup. And the idea of today is to take you through a good portion of that setup and those sort of considerations as part of setting up a user to then apply to your existing user. So I'm James Rodder, and what we'll do is just drill into it. So today's agenda is, as I was saying, all around the user. So what we're going to do is work through a scenario of onboarding a new user. Their user ID, the name, some other attributes as well as part of the user setup. We'll go through that and some additional areas linked to that setup. We'll also talk about licensing and the allocation of licenses and the different types of licenses that are available within SAP Business One. We'll then go into the authorization of that user. So, read access, read-only access, full access, no access to particular modules and work centers within SAP Business One. How is that all handled, and are there, quick and efficient ways of managing that? We'll go through that. We'll go also into how the system looks and feels, the user experience, how to tailor the system to those different functions and roles throughout the organization so they only see what they need to see within SAP Business One, and how easily is it to adapt the system to make it easy to follow for those, for a new user to experience SAP Business One. From there, we'll just talk about other areas of consideration as part of the user setup. There's a lot of features and functions within SAP Business One. Not all sites use these features, but things to think about as part of setting up a new user. Okay, so from there, what we'll do is jump into SAP Business One. And here we have it. So currently I'm logged on as the system administrator, Jack Smith. So he's a super user within SAP Business One, and that is a requirement in order to set up a new user and go through the steps today. So generally it will be the manager user, but if you've been flagged as a super user within SAP Business One, you will have access to do these particular functions that I'm about to show you. So on the left-hand side, we have our menu. So just before I continue, this is on SAP Business One version 9.3. I'm in the HANA version of 9.3. This is applicable to the SQL version as well. So for those who are on SQL and you're seeing a bit of a different look and feel, it's the same capabilities that's in the SQL version, Microsoft SQL version. All right, so what we're going to do first is set up a new user. I'm going to set up a new user called Alison Smith, and what we do there is under administration, we go into the setup work center, and then under general, we have a number of options, and the one that we're after is the user setup. So when we click on that, we get presented with this particular window. This window allows me to create new users and also look at other users that are already set up. You may need to do, log on to this particular screen if someone's forgotten their password or they need to reset their password. So if you're already doing that function, you'll be familiar with this. But for today, we'll go through the process of setting up a new user. So up the top, I'm hitting the add button, and we'll go through the necessary fields. So the first field is the user code. So, for all of us that are familiar with systems, you need a unique identifier to set up the user. So when they log in, that's their unique ID. It could be their name, it could be their employee number, it could be anything. But it's in SAP Business One, it's the user code for accessing the system. So We're going to keep it simple. So for Alison Smith, we're just going to give the user code of Alison. Now, for those systems, well, those sites that have multiple databases, be careful with the user code setup. If you set up Alison, for example, the system is case sensitive. So if you set up Alison in one system with all caps, and then another in the other systems, you do it in lowercase, the system doesn't effectively see them as a single user. So just be careful with that. You might end up double dipping on your license count. So just make sure there's continuity with the user setup, especially the user code. All right, so from there we have the username. So we'll go Alison Smith. And then we go into an area called defaults. So, you know, defaults is a way of defaulting information into particular screens. So if you, for example, have multiple locations, multiple warehouses, and let's say Alison is based in Melbourne, you want the warehouse default to Melbourne rather than another warehouse. So it just allows them to have, expedite processing of documents in the system. So within this system, we've got a number of defaults set up. Here's a few examples of Melbourne admin, logistics, or sales. So Alison's is part of the sales division, so I'm going to allocate her to that. But what I'll do is just drill into the defaults and give you a sense of what that means. So it's to override the overall global defaults of the system. So when we set up SAP Business One, we set up a global default, the baseline default for all users. But then the user defaults allows us to do override those global defaults with user defaults. And here are a few areas that that you can consider. So for Melbourne sales, you might have different address details that need to appear on invoicing or purchase order information. So you might want to override the global default with the user defaults. There's additional tabs here around, the look and feel. So you've got time formatting, date formatting, and whatnot as well, if that's important to users to have those areas defined in a particular way. But generally, what people mostly do with this type of function is make sure that the warehouse defaults correctly. So, if they're raising sales orders or purchase orders and they're mainly based in a particular location, just default the warehouse correctly so they don't have to do another series of keystrokes to get the warehouse up to date every time they raise a document. So that's the typical use case. There's also, cash on hand. So if you're running a point of sale arrangement, making sure that the cash on hand account is correct, checks received. Also, with the AR invoice and payment screen, if you use that, what customer defaults into that, just to distinguish maybe different terminals or different locations. Again, it's all part of the user default setup. There's also display options. So there's a number of ways of changing the look and feel. Mostly, it's most sites focus on the font size. Depending on your age and a few other things, you might need to increase or decrease the font size. It could come down to screen resolution. So this gives you the option to override again the global default font size to something tailored to user defaults. There's also the print options as well. So, with Alison being in the sales team, if she's raising a lot of quotes, she might need to have a different quotation print configuration as part of the setup for her. So, here's a number of options here. So when adding the document, what should the system do? So, we can export to Word, we can print the document straight away or email the document. And then you've got parameter options on how many copies get produced. So, this just tailors the system to that individual and the role and function, and trying to reduce the number of keystrokes where defaults can apply. So it's definitely something to look into if you're not using it already. It will just streamline a lot of things for particular users. So we'll go ahead and apply Melbourne sales to Alison. From there, we've got additional fields to fill in. So SAP Business One has the ability to have single sign-on. So that means that we bind the Microsoft credentials. So when you log onto your PC, to bind those credentials to SAP Business One. There's a few bit of configuration involved in the backend to get the sharing of authentication between Microsoft Windows and SAP Business One. But once that's done, all you're doing here is putting in the details of the credentials of the Windows account. So it will be your domain and the username. So let's say it was Alison S. That would then mean that when they log in the morning, that's one less set of credentials that needs to be entered into the system. The next field is employee. I'll roll back to that a bit later. But the remaining steps are email address. So this is important if you use the alerts function and you want to email people, users alerts rather than receive them within SAP Business One. It uses this email address. So make sure that's updated. Mobile phone. The mobile phone and mobile device ID is important for this option up the top here, a mobile user. So there isn't a mobile app available to be downloaded onto either your Apple or Android device to access SAP Business One on your mobile phone. So as part of that setup, when you install the mobile app, it prompts you with a device ID. That device ID needs to be entered there. And the reason for that is just to add another layer of security. So not everyone can just download the app and access your system. There's a binding between that device, that mobile phone, and the setup of the user, again, to log in and access the data within SAP Business One. Got the fax number, so you can definitely plug that in. And then you got other sort of grouping information around this user. So you've got the access, the ability to define branches. So again, if you've got multiple locations, you can set them up as branches. And then you also got departments. So here's a few examples, administration, assembly, so some abbreviated forms of departments I've got here. I've got this one here, SLS, which I know is sales. So I just want to allocate Alison to the Melbourne branch and the sales department. From there, we can then define groups. So this ties into areas of authorization and the user experience. I'll again loop back to that a bit later on to explain how that works. The next step is defining the initial password. So when I drill into this section here, it allows me to come up with the initial password for Alison. So at the moment, it's saying that the password complexity is only a minimum of 4 characters in length. So pretty straightforward password policy that's been set up within SAP Business One. That is governed by a feature under Setup. So we're still in admin on the left-hand side, Setup, General, and then towards the bottom here, we've got Security and Password Administration. So within this password administration module, we can see the different levels of security that we can apply. So we've got defaults of low, medium, and high. So at the moment, we've got low, and that's just a character length of 4. But if I go to high, then we've got additional levels of security of expiry date of 30 days, minimum character length of 8, and then other, mixed case using alphanumeric characters and digits and whatnot. So for those who, if you've got a cloud-based instance of SAP Business One, so you can access via the web, it's always advised to have a higher level of security because of the nature of cloud. So very important to set the password level or complexity level to the right class, I guess, for the setup of SAP Business One, if it's been hosted in the cloud or if it's on premise. So you might come up with a custom complexity, so you can override the values that are indicated here. But once you define that, and when you set up users, the system will then enforce that complexity of passwords. So for today, I'm just going to keep it pretty straightforward. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Don't advise that as a password, but I'm sure all of us know passwords are pretty important when it comes to most systems that you deal with day to day. Then on the left, we've got some additional conditions. So password never expires. So generally used for super users. So on the top left, you'll see the indicator of a super user. So if you're a super user, you have full rights to the system. Equivalent to who I'm logged in as at the moment, Jack Smith. So you can effectively administrate the system. You're a system administrator. It's not advised to have too many super users. Generally, you would have 1 or 2 with the ability to make, these sort of changes or set up new users. And for those individuals that do have that responsibility, they need to be flagged as a super user. So that normally ties with that. Change password at next login. So this applies to, Alison. We're setting her up for the first time with that initial password, and when she logs in, the system will prompt her to change that initial password. We have locked, so if Alison no longer needs access to SAP Business One, has moved on, we simply lock that user so they can no longer access the system. Pretty straightforward. So I'll add Alison. And now she's in the system. So her credentials, the ability to log in to the system is now in place. But before I go too far with setting up authorizations, there's a few other sort of master data considerations with setting up a user. When it comes to sales users in particular, there's another module under the setup general area called sales employees and buyers. You set up this to then append them as a sales employee to transactions. So, if there's recognition of sales to sales employees, the best method of handling that is to set them up as a sales employee / buyer. So what I'll do is just quickly set up Alison Smith here. You can define territories and commissions in a whole lot of areas like this. There's also the ability to link the employee, which I'll show you shortly. But what this means is now Alison Smith can be allocated to a sales document. So if I go to sales and raise a sales order, what we just set up is the ability for Alison to be linked to a sales document. So generally only applicable to sales reps or managers, maybe the internal sales staff, to then be linked to that sales document. So they might be, there might be recognition, there might be reward, remuneration, a whole bunch of areas related to that. Make sure you go through this process of setting up the sales employee when you set up the user. The other area of consideration is setting them up as a human resource employee. So this then allows additional functionality, around them being a resource within SAP Business One, and then they can then be linked to other documents. This ties to service calls if you're using the service calls. It also ties into the sales order entry as well. So I'll quickly set this up. So it's Alison Smith. We'll get that right. You have options to set these up. So I'll say that she's in business development, sales, and in the Melbourne branch again. I can then tie her to a manager, and this forms an org chart, which I'll show you shortly. I can then link the employee to the user. and then I can link the employee to the sales employee as well. There's a whole lot of additional information here. I won't go through it all, but phone numbers and mobiles that you can link here. There's also the ability to set up memberships, so teams. So Alison might be part of the sales department, but there might be subsets or smaller teams within the department, specialist roles or anything like that. You can set up membership. Administration, just indicators of when they started and ended, generally handled by your payroll HR application, but you can manage it here as well within SAP Business One. Personal finance, there's a few areas to consider, but it really comes down to the lead system around HR as a whole. But I'd always recommend setting them the minimal amount of information. I would say that's this top section here in SAP Business One. So I've set up Alison there. And if I go into the sales order now, there was another field down the bottom here called owner. If I sort by that, I can now see Alison is available to be selected as an owner of the document. So that generally defaults when you create a new document. Just to link, so it's easily seen that who raised this document, and then you can also then see who's going to be recognized for the document. So you've got sales employee and owner. Things to consider. Okay, so what we've gone through is set up a user. We've also set up the sales employee because of the nature of Alison, and then we've set up the employee master data. So from a master data perspective, configuration, Alison is all set. Now we've got to start considering licensing. So you need a license in order to access SAP Business One to start then operating within it. So back to administration. Directly under administration, we have a work center called license, and then underneath that we have license administration. So to run through the screen, on the left-hand side we have all the users that are set up in the system. You'll also notice that some user codes are in grey. That means they're currently logged into the system. And that effectively means that you can't adjust the licensing allocation on the right-hand side. So hopefully you can see it on your side that this screen has grayed out, meaning I cannot edit, say, Brett's licensing arrangement until Brett has logged out. Alison has yet to be logged in yet, so this is all active, and then I can allocate the necessary license. So within SAP Business One, there are 4 different types of license. It's the professional user, which entitles that user to have full access to every single feature and module within SAP Business One. And then we have limited users of CRM, financials, and logistics. And those limited licenses, restrict, is the baseline restriction on how, what modules and features this user can access. So Alison's in sales, and I'm going to allocate her to a CRM user. I'm also going to allocate an add-on user. Now, if you are a site that has add-ons, industry add-ons, or there's a number of them out there, allocate an add-on. But even if you don't, you just allocate a SAP add-on license by default. So just get in the habit of allocating that just to cover your bases. So when I do that, I've allocated the CRM license. Now, as I was saying, there's a baseline to these limited licenses. We do have a spreadsheet available that details the level of access each of the limited licenses has, which I'm opening up now. So this is a full detail of either if this user has full read-only or no access to a particular feature. So to run through this particular spreadsheet, which you can request from us to access, we see the modules on the left-hand side and then the functionality within those modules. And then across the top here, we've got the different license types of professional, CRM, logistics, and financial, and we've got a few additional ones here, but I'll just focus on these 4 today. And then you will just see this matrix of, what access the individual can have. So if we go through this, you'll see that by default, professional will just have full access to everything, but the limited license varies. So when we look at, say, the financial module, you'll see that the financial limited license has full access, but then a CRM user does not. So even if we give them the authorization within SAP Business One, which I'm about to take you through shortly, they won't be able to access it due to the license they have. So you just got to balance the right type of license with the right type of individual with the authorization. So this is a detailed document. Very important for you to have a copy of this just to gauge, if you've got onboarding a new user, to gauge the type of license they may require and allocate accordingly. So just back to SAP Business One. Just a few additional areas that I'll just talk about. So we've got components. So this just gives us an overview of how many licenses we have available. So we've only got one CRM license available in total, and only one license in total and 0 available. And you can pretty much click on them on the different licensing components on the left-hand side, and then you'll see, I guess, the status of the licensing on the right-hand side. The last tab is assignment. This gives you a matrix view of who's been allocated what. So I can see Alison's been allocated a CRM limited license. I can see Brett has been allocated a limited logistics, and we see Kathy's got a financial. So this just gives you an understanding of where the licenses have been allocated quickly and efficiently. All right, so that's the licensing. The next step I'll go through is what I touched on earlier, was just authorization. So license have been allocated, so Alison will only be able to access the CRM functionality, but then I might want to tailor it over and above that using user authorizations. So under system initialization this time, authorizations and general authorizations, we have this authorization screen. So in the middle here, I'll just minimize this a little. In the middle here, we have the subjects, which is a reflection of the menu structure that we have within SAP Business One. So you'll see administration, financials, purchasing, and we have those modules on the left-hand side. We've also got additional areas such as general and customization tools, and those are quite important things to consider when setting up a user around just some of the options across the ribbon, and reporting, and a few additional areas as well. But before I go into that, I've got Kathy indicated here. I see a number of columns, so the subject, the authorization, and effective authorization. And this works with the combination of discrete authorization allocation, I guess, versus what we call the group authentication. So 2 approaches, I guess, you can take with setting up a user. You can set up a user case by case and go through this this authorization module and go through and say, well, Kathy needs this, or we're setting up Alison. Alison needs this access screen by screen. So if we're talking about sales AR, you can go through each of these options here. So Alison may need access to quotes and orders, but may not need access to deliveries, return requests, what have you. So as you can see, if you take that approach, there's a lot to consider. There's a lot of options here to figure out and then fine tune to get right for Alison. The alternate approach is using groups. Just before I touch on this, I just want to make sure there's an understanding between authorization and effective authorization. So you'll see here under banking for Kathy, within this user authorization setup, she has no access to banking. But on the right-hand side, we will say she has effective full authorization. And this is, again, the balance between discrete user authorizations to group user authorizations. And the way this SAP figures out what level of access a user has, it's pretty much the highest level of authentication. So if I go, for example, if I look at, say, inventory, the effective authorization is no authorization. But if I change this to full, Kathy has full authorization regardless of the groups that we've allocated her to. So SAP will always give the user the highest level of access. There are 3 different types of access. There's like no authorization. There's also read-only, meaning that that individual can access that particular functionality, but can only review that data, can only see that data, and cannot make any additions or edits to that data. And then we have full authorization, meaning they can do adds, edits, depending on the setup of the system, deletes, cancellations, a whole range of things as well. So, as part of the user setup, those are just things to consider. So on the left-hand side here, we've got an additional tab called Groups. And this is the different way of approaching setting up a user. So, rather than tailoring authorizations per user, you can just define groups of access. And the examples that I have on the left-hand side is, finance authorization, CRM authorization, logistics, and so on and so forth. So when you have someone new to come on board, or if you need to edit someone's existing access, you can say, okay, well, you need the level of access to drive CRM activities. So you would just allocate that user to the CRM authorization group for CRM in this example. And when we set that up, you are just going through and defining the level of access for the CRM authorizations. The good thing about groups, you can allocate a user to multiple groups. So you can look at it in a compartment that when I'm thinking about CRM authorizations, I just need to consider CRM functionality. If I'm thinking logistics, I just have to think about logistics functionality regardless of the type of user. So what I'll do to hopefully make this make any sort of sense is go back up to the setup of Alison. And go into this area here called groups. And what we'll see here is that what I showed you in this earlier screen is the different types of groups that we've set up in the system and the level of access that group gives to users. So Alison is a CRM user, so I'll allocate her to CRM, but she might have some additional requirements. She might do some AR, accounts receivable duties as well, and also logistics. There's also baseline, like I guess it's just a good idea that whenever you set up a user, there's some just baseline functionality required in order to access the system. I'll click on that and then I'll show you what I mean. So if I go back into authorization and go to baseline authorization, we're talking about the general access. And this, as I was saying, ties into sort of, I guess, horizontal features within SAP, meaning they apply to a whole lot of areas. So this top one of send message, it's a function of any sort of module. So it could be purchase orders or invoices. And this is just gauging, does a typical user send messages? Does a user access print layout defaults? So there's a few areas of consideration around just setting up the baseline. you know, document settings and what have you. There's a few areas to consider, and when it comes to just any sort of access to the system. Another important section which can stump user access is under administration. There's a feature called numbering series, and the numbering series is the feature that governs the sequence of numbers for particular documents. So your invoice number, your sales order number, your purchase order number. For a user to create a new document, they need access to the numbering series. So that's a typical thing that we have coming through the support desk. You've set up a user, you've given them access to sales orders, and they've got full access to sales orders, but they can't create a new sales order for some reason. It's generally because they don't have access to the numbering series that sales orders are linked to. Generally, it's series number 1, but depending on, again, your users, your setup of SAP Business One, you might have multiple different series, and you'll just need to configure accordingly. Other areas to consider, so back to general, is around lock periods. So period status. So if you are a financial user or an AP user and you need to backdate transactions into previous periods, you might need access to unlocked periods except sales. That means that, you know, for sales, you can only post in the current month, but for previous sales, previous activities such as, you know, journal entries or purchase orders, you know, AP invoices that are a bit delayed, you can still backdate those transactions. So that's an important thing to consider if you're part of either finance or accounts payable. All right, so that's the area of around authorization, and as I was saying, there's a difference between read-only and no access. So at the moment, I'm logged on as the system administrator, and if I go into something like business partners, I have full access to the system. So if I go into, say, a customer like BlueZoom, I can access anything here. I can make edits, I can change things, I can create new business partners, whatever, because I have full access. If I are a different user, so if I log on to a different user, which I've got set up here, so I've just jumped into another instance of SAP Business One, Kathy has been set up with only read-only access. So if I do those same steps, business partners, and do BlueZoom, you'll see, hopefully you can see on your side, that everything's grayed out, meaning I can see the information, I can drill down in a few things, but I cannot make any edits or additions or anything like that. So that's an example of read-only access to a particular feature within SAP Business One. And the last one is no access. So I've just jumped into another user who only has, who doesn't have any access to business partners. So I'm logged on as Brett now. And if I go to business partners and business partner master data, it comes up with this prompt saying that you're not permitted to access this, but you know, you can then ask a authorized user to give you temporary privileges. So if I give Brett temporary access, so I'm going to use my manager credentials. Brett now has access, so I can go to BlueZoom again, and I've got access. As soon as Brett closes that down and jumps back into it, it's the same process again. So that gives you, I guess, hopefully that gives you an understanding of the difference between full access, read-only access, and no access. All right. What I'm going to go through next is how to tailor, I guess, the user experience, so the look and feel of SAP Business One for particular users. So we've given them the access to a particular module. So Alison has access to CRM, logistics, AR, and the baseline authorization. But now I want to configure the look and feel, and there's a number of ways you can handle this. Under administration, utilities, and UI configuration templates. This now allows me to adapt the screens of SAP Business One to suit either the organization as a whole or for particular users or functions within the business. So, excuse me, on the left-hand side, we have the different UI templates that we've already set up, and I've got examples here of different varying levels of access to the sales order screen. And the way that this is set up is based on the user group setup again. So I've set up groups called restricted, limited, full, and temporary user. And when we set up the user, we allocate them to one of these UI configuration template groups. And then when they log on, they'll get the look and feel that we dictate within the form setup. So currently I'm on sales order restricted, and I've got this example here of the form sales order. And when I click on that, I have the ability to edit the form UI. So when I click on that, you'll see the sales order screen opens up, but it has this black bar and it's stating UI edit mode. This means that I now can adjust the screen to my whim. So I'm logged on as the administrator, so I'm making the necessary changes that the organisation has decided on, and it's pretty straightforward. You can click on a field here, and it then lightens up, and then I can make adjustments. I can move fields around, so I've clicked on this, and then I can move the field around if necessary. So this might be applicable if you're wanting to move, say, logistics information to the main screen, to the header or the footer of the screen. If you think, seeing if the document's approved or not is very important to you, you might want to put that to the header of the screen. So if I go to content or any other tab, I always see the approved flag. Other options here is when I click on a field and right click, I have the option of hide, disable, or disabled. So if I go disabled, it means that this field is effectively read only for the users that have been allocated to this UI configuration. They can see it, but they cannot edit this field and this field only. The other option is to hide. So if I want to clean up the screen and get rid of fields that aren't relevant to you as a business, you can just hide the field, and that just cleans up the screen, and you can remove areas of the system that you don't consider. I can then always go restore to default, and that will take it back to the original setup of SAP Business One as it comes out of the box, and then we have everything back to where it was. So generally, what people do is they go into areas. So if I'm in a sales order and I only want users to see the accounting data and not edit it, there's a number of approaches you could take. You can highlight all the fields here, right click it, and then just hide or disable these fields. So I've select them all and I've disabled them all, meaning that they're only read only. I could hide all these fields. So if I only wanted to hide these fields on the right hand side, I can click on that and hit hide. Or I could suppress this whole tab. So in order to do that, it's slightly different. I need to go into the form settings up the top here. And then I go in, so this new window opens up called form settings. And what I go into is the UI elements, and then I go to the necessary section. So these are all the different UI elements that we've set up. And you'll see that there's a section here called accounting, and you'll see that some fields have already been deactivated. But if I want to suppress that whole tab, I can then untick that, and then the accounting tab disappears. So this is a good feature to, again, just simplify the system, make it easy for, say, a new starter to digest and only see the necessary fields that's relevant to them. It also comes down to the form, this main body of this main grid as well. So if I go back to the form UI setup and go to table format this time, I can, display fields. So if I want to see item description, I can bring that through. If I want to suppress discount, I can do that. And then I can see that the form UI setup has been adjusted accordingly. Another thing you may consider, so if you have user-defined fields, so I've got them on the right-hand side here, which where they get up, when you set up user-defined fields, that's where they go initially. But if I wanted to create a new tab, I can right-click and add a tab, and I can call it, say, additional info. I can then access this additional info tab and then start bringing some of these fields across. As simple as that. So it just allows you to, again, tailor the setup of the screen, the setup of SAP Business One to your own requirements. There's a number of options here. So, to get this all nicely aligned, I can then align it to the left or to the bottom or the top, just to make it look a bit more attractive. But effectively, that's it. You can then adjust the look and feel of the setup. So I can save that now. And that means that the sales order restricted setup has been configured. I can then copy this setup to the other setups of sales orders. So I can say that users that have limited access to sales orders can have that as a baseline, and then I can increase the level of, increase the number of fields exposed, and I can repeat that process. So it's something that requires a bit of, you get familiar with, but then you need an approach to handling, the UI configuration. You see, it's a powerful tool, but you want to have a consistent user experience across all users. So, if you've got people collaborating and they're looking at screens and they're looking radically different, that might be a bit of a burden. So you want to make sure that the overall look and feel is quite similar between users, regardless of their access and privileges to the system. All right, so that's the UI configuration. So that's the look and feel. The other areas to consider when setting up a new user, and these are optional features, is things such as alert management. So if I wanted Alison to subscribe to particular alerts, I need to make sure that I go into alert management and allocate Alison to the necessary alerts. So I've got this alert here for overdue sales orders. Make sure that you allocate Alison to the right one. There is a different approach. You can also set up groups to govern to allocate a suite of alerts to users as well. So categorize your alerts into different groups, and then you can allocate those groups to users, and that may streamline the setup of a user. Another area to consider is approval procedures. So if you're a business that have approval procedures in place, and if Alison is either an authorizer or a originator of an approval process, make sure you go through this step as well. So under administration approval process, I'm in approval stages. So this is where you'll set up Alison if she approves documents. So if she needs to be part of the executive team, you can set up Alison just like this, and then she's part of that team that can approve particular approval procedures. You can also go into, you will need to go into approval templates. So if Alison is, say, part of this approval template, so if a sales order is below 5% gross profit, you would just need to make sure you add Alison to that approval process as well. If she's not there, she won't be confined, or the approval procedure won't consider her as part of that approval procedure. All right, so that's what we wanted to cover today. I'm running a bit over time. There was a lot to digest there. So take this on board and take some of the concepts away and discuss with your team about how you set up a user, the different authorizations, the different licensing. That user interface setup can be quite involved but quite powerful. So really tailoring SAP Business One to your workflows, your organization arrangement, and a few things like that. So just have a strategy in place before going ahead and setting that up. As always advised, you can always set up a test system. Most of our sites, most of you as customers will have test systems. So always best to log into that and get familiar with the features and functions. There's material available online and on the help file to assist you with that's to get you across that feature and the approach that you need to do. But then once you're familiar with that, then have a strategy around the user experience and privileges that you want across the system and what have you. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap things up there. So again, thanks for attending this morning. Hopefully you found that useful. We're planning on doing these webinars far more regularly. If you have any ideas regarding different types of webinars you'd like to see, if it's particular features and functions that you'd like to get across, also if you want to get across different types of add-ons, if you're looking at reporting or business intelligence or CRM tools, we can always organize webinars. It's just a case of understanding what you guys are looking for. So if you've got any ideas, contact us on our support team. Any suggested webinars, that will be always helpful. Ideas are always helpful on our side. All right, so thanks guys. Enjoy the rest of your day.